We beginnen nu met een sessie over historische contexten. In de eerste lezing die we gisteren hadden van Nicholas Langlitz werd er al verwezen naar het belang eigenlijk van de historische context voor onderzoek naar psychedelica. En de twee sprekers die we vandaag in deze sessie hebben gaan hier nader op in. We beginnen zo meteen met Wouter Hanegaaf. Hij is hoogleraar in de geschiedenis van het hermetisme en you know, I'm going to do it in English, that's better. So today we're gonna start with two historians who will address the problems of the contextualization and the importance of psychedelics in history. The first speaker will be Wouter Hanegaaf. He is professor in Hermetic philosophy and related currents at the University of Amsterdam. He is one of the world's greatest experts in Hermeticism and esotericism. And these are, of course, currents which also have some overlap with psychedelic use in the past. And Wouter especially advocates serious and professional historical research rather than the mythology that often occurs in these matters. So Wouter, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. I will share the screen right away. One moment. Okay, there we go. I hope that everybody can see the screen like this. Is this okay like this? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'll go. Yeah, I have only 15 minutes, so I will get straight to the point. Well, the title of my presentation, Psychedelics as Rejected Knowledge, refers to a book that I published 8 years ago about the study of Western esotericism, which you can see here. And this book is not about psychedelics. It's about historical processes through which the intellectual elites of Western culture have been defining their own identity by creating a kind of negative wastebasket category, as I call it, of rejected knowledge. So you define who you are by defining what you are not. Now, the form that this takes often is that entire fields of cultural activity and human inquiry used to be presented in scholarly research and often are still presented as illegitimate, wrong-minded, unserious, ridiculous, and possibly dangerous by default. Chief examples of this are magic, the occult, superstition, the irrational, the primitive, and those kind of terms. So the message is then that this kind of stuff is not to be taken seriously. In other words, if you are a serious academic, you do not want your name to be associated with studying such stuff. Now, I analyzed this process, and why is this a problem, this attitude? It's a problem because this attitude has led to systematic and deliberately cultivated ignorance among academics about what are actually very important and influential dimensions of Western culture and intellectual history. Scholars were not supposed to waste their time on such nonsense. And as a result, until recently, these domains were no longer studied at all. They got marginalized, neglected, treated as if they hardly existed. They vanished from research agendas and were left mostly to amateur scholars who went on to produce a lot of publications of often doubtful quality, so that the reputation of the field deteriorated even further. So you get a negative spiral. This has begun to change for a couple of decades, slowly. Now, in this short lecture, I want to argue that psychedelics have been the victim of very similar discursive processes of ideological exclusion. I give one example here. My focus generally here is on how academic historians deal with visions and voices in historical sources. Because throughout history, people have reported impressive, often spectacular visionary revelations from gods, from angels, demons, spirits, and so on. Some of the most influential and most successful religions, world religions, which have changed the world, have originated in such visionary revelations. Therefore, the study of visions would seem to be obviously very important. Just one example I give here, the Prophet Muhammad, and no one less than him, made solitary retreats into a cave where he received visions and revelations from the angel Gabriel. The result is the Quran, one of the most influential books in world history. How do you get such visions? Well, they typically require some kind of alteration of consciousness. For instance, in the case of Muhammad, it's very plausible to assume that the altered states in which he encountered Gabriel were caused by sensory deprivation in a cave, extreme darkness, extreme silence, and then the brain will start to compensate for the lack of sensory input by creating visions and voices. But in other cases, we have direct evidence that such altered states were caused by psychedelics of some kind. Now, my first example has hardly ever been mentioned by scholars of psychedelics, so I hope it will be of some interest. This is the so-called Mithras liturgy. You see here a manuscript page. This is a manuscript on papyrus, written in Greek. It comes from the first centuries of the Common Era. It comes from Egypt, probably around Thebes. And it was written by Egyptian priests. So to give the context of the time. Now, this is a very famous text. This is not some marginal text. It has been studied carefully, meticulously since the 19th century. We have excellent critical commented editions like this one, with commentaries, with translations, with annotations, and so on. But something strange is nevertheless going on here. Standard academic scholarship, such as this critical edition by Hans-Dieter Betz, gives extremely detailed attention to each and every single line and word of the Greek text. Excellent, extensive, very learned, very erudite commentaries. Nevertheless, until very recently, almost all specialists have kept silent, strangely, about the fact that about 1/5 of this famous text, the Mithras liturgy, consists of a recipe for making an eye ointment or an eye salve with evidently psychedelic effects. You had to rub it in or around your eyes so that it would be absorbed by the skin. And the text is essentially a trip report, really, of a spectacular visionary revelation. It's all about a visionary encounter with the great sun god, Helios Mithras. And so the sun, very important in Egypt, of course, next to the Nile. I have no time to take you through the strict report, but the female, very briefly, the female practitioner, it's a woman, feels that she is lifted up into the air. She begins to perceive the heavenly bodies like awesome spiritual entities, like animated deities that might attack her. She has to do all kinds of ritual stuff. She has to do invocations, etc. But finally, she comes face to face with the sun god himself. And so I show the sun here. Now she is looking at the sun, then in the interior of the sun, she is perceiving great doors. That's what the text says. These doors open, the doors of perception, you might almost say, so that she can see the world of the gods inside, which will give her great joy, according to the text. Now, out of the sun, out of those doors, then come awe-inspiring entities. And I try to visualize this a little bit. First, she sees 7 goddesses with the faces of snakes coming out. So there you have them. Then these 7 goddesses are joined by 7 gods with the faces of bulls. And then finally the sun god, Helios Mithras himself, appears. There you have him. Now, this sun god then answers the practitioner's questions in the form of an oracle in verse, in Greek verse, interestingly. And after that he departs, and the practitioner will feel weak in her body. I assume that this is because of the after effects of the psychedelic. She will not feel in her normal state of mind, but later she will remember all the details of the revelation. This is what we can read in the text. The text also says you can try this as many times as you like, and you will see that it always works. You will be super amazed. That's the literal translation of the Greek word. Well, the strange thing is that almost no scholar, to my knowledge, it has changed a little bit in very recent times, but almost no scholar has asked the rather obvious question of how to account for such an experience. What's going on here? The implicit assumption seems to be that, well, they must have made it all up. This is all just fantasy. Or worse, they also must have been crazy, because all that, this kind of stuff doesn't happen to normal people, does it? Well, almost nobody, and certainly none of the chief specialists, I have to say, has given any serious attention to the recipe. And nevertheless, this is 1/5 of the complete text. It is just treated as if it's hardly there or not there at all. Well, what does the recipe contain? It's rather complicated. It contains the blue lotus, which is known for for narcotic properties. There are references to mirror. Well, that is problematic. There is evidence that it can have narcotic effects in certain texts, but it is somewhat debatable. Then there is the sun scarab. This is speculative as well. Sun scarabs live on dung heaps. So dung heaps, you can speculate, and it has been speculated that these are full of the mycelium of psilocybe mushrooms. And therefore, one possible explanation is that these sun beetles are actually loaded with psilocybin. That is debatable. I'm not insisting on it. Very importantly, there is a plant, Kentritis, and we would like to know what it is, but we don't. This was a plant that apparently the readers of these texts knew how to identify. It is described, but we have not been able to identify it as yet. Then there is also kifi, a famous incense that was used in Egyptian temples. Again, almost certainly with mild narcotic effects and certainly with a strong effect on the imagination. This is attested by several sources from antiquity. What happens in the combined effects of these substances, it's anybody's guess. The combination of these substances, we do not know. Because we do not have Kentritis, and we cannot be sure exactly, so we cannot make it again and try it out. Nevertheless, this recipe is very clearly the key to the entire vision in the Mithras literature. Now, my point, here's another picture of this kind of papyri that you're studying from the Greek magical papyri, as they are called. Well, my point is that the recipe gives us a perfectly rational explanation for the visions. But nevertheless, it gets ignored because as a scholar, you're not supposed to take psychedelics very seriously. This could harm your career. And so scholars don't. But as a result of that, readers of these texts who are not told about the presence of the recipe have no other alternative than to conclude that either the authors just made it all up, they tried to pull our leg, or they must have been crazy. They must have been delusional, irrational, possibly psychotic. In both cases, readers end up with a very dim view of these texts and traditions. Clearly just fanciful stuff or nonsense that deserves to be dumped into the wastebasket of rejected knowledge. It has to be studied as strange stuff from a long time ago, but you cannot take it seriously. Now, my second example is more well known. This is the famous witches' ointment from the Middle Ages and the early modern time in particular. Now here you see on a painting from Franz Franken the Younger, the Witch's Kitchen from 1606, you see how in the popular imagination this was supposed to work. In the kettle on the left here, you can see, of course, how witches are creating some horrible ointment and some of the ingredients are here. And on the right, the witches undress and then they get their skin rubbed in with this ointment, as you can see here. And then on the far left, there you see one of them vanishing through the chimney on her way to the witch's Sabbath. How stereotypical can you get, right? It's very stereotypical. And on one level, for us, perhaps it's funny to look at these paintings and these imaginations. It's far less amusing if you realize that how many innocent people between the 15th and the 18th century were actually killed by hanging or by burning at the stake alive because people widely believed these stories and these imaginations. Not so funny, actually. Now, mainstream scholarship has invested very strongly in the conviction that the witch craze was based entirely on fantasies, the fantasies of the Inquisition, obviously not on any truth. Few scholars nowadays dare to challenge this orthodoxy and claim that there may actually have been some kind of reality to the witchcraft accusations, because it seems that if you make that argument, you seem to be taking the inquisitor's side against the victims. So scholars don't like to do that. You can see this here in this controversy. On the right, you see a book by Edward Bever, recent book, which analyzes the documented evidence and concludes that there is in fact an empirical basis for the assumption that psychedelic flying ointments were being used, or witches' ointments were being used by some people at least, resulting in very vivid hallucinations that can help us explain that people really believed that they had been to the Sabbath. As a result, you can read this in the scholarly literature, Bever has gotten attacked by colleagues with incredible aggression, I have to say. And one example you see on the left. So these polemics you can trace in the scholarly literature over the last couple of years. We are not allowed to question the standard assumption that it all comes down to morbid fantasies on the part of the Inquisition. And even if some people really believed that they had been flying to the Witches' Sabbath, then it seems to be considered preferable by the mainstream of scholarship in this field to assume that, well, if they believed that, they must have been crazy. They must have been out of their minds. Nevertheless, although part of the evidence is certainly circumstantial, you have to be very careful analyzing these sources. Nevertheless, we have some very unambiguous evidence, and I think Bever is right here, so I take his side. I can only show you the titles here for lack of time, but this one example, Johannes Nieder's Formicarius from 1437, a text in Latin, as you can see, and if you have the time to read it, you can see that the evidence is right here. The underlined lines for this witch's ointment. Here's another often quoted source by a medical authority, and very influential guy actually, Andres Laguna from 1555. And again, here is the evidence. It has descriptions of a green ointment that, and the effects that it has. It is always the same kind of plants from the nightshade family, this is well known, that are being mentioned. And one of the best known recipes to actually make the salve has been published by an influential author from the 16th century, Giambattista della Porta, whom you see here in the 16th century. And this ointment has been famously tried out actually by a 20th century folklore specialist, historian of magic, a German, Will Erich Peukertz. So here you have him. When he was young, with a buddy, when he was 20 years old, they stripped naked, they put the ointment on their bodies, and they were unconscious for about 24 hours. They could have killed themselves because it's really dangerous stuff. But they had very vivid visions of flying through the air, arriving at big festivities, full of ecstatic dancing and a lot of sex. And Peukertz has written about this in manuscripts and that I've studied. Well, to conclude my story, as you can see, I'm looking at the clock. In a way, the sensational nature, of course, of this kind of stories about witchcraft, the sensational nature itself almost seems to work against investigating their factual foundations. If you look at the imagery, of course, these are fantasies. There's no doubt about it. This is the sensational way in which people were thinking about witchcraft. But underneath them, I think Bever is right, that there is a history of folkloric use of psychedelic plants. We have the recipes, we have the descriptions, with an obviously strong impact on the history of religion and culture. So I come to my conclusions, with an image from the Datura plant, which is one of the plants that are very often found in these recipes. And my conclusions are rather simple. What we know as scholars of religion is that visionary revelations are a serious and important phenomenon in Western culture and religious history. They typically occur as a result of alterations of consciousness of some kind. And there is a wide variety, of course. Such states can be induced in various ways, including psychedelics. All of that is well known to the audience I'm addressing today. Now, dismissing the psychedelic factor out of hand plays into an ideological agenda of dismissing all visionary revelations as either pure fantasy or as symptoms of mental illness, so that they can be safely dumped then into the wastebasket of rejected knowledge rather than being taken seriously. And this, I think, has to change. We have to take this stuff seriously. I am arguing that we are dealing with alternative sources of knowledge or claimed knowledge that can actually be rationally accounted for in terms of alterations of consciousness, including psychedelics. Among the various factors that can induce such effects of consciousness, psychedelics must be studied empirically by historians without ideological blinders or agendas either way, either apologetic of trying to defend psychedelics or try to fight against it. I think it must be done from a neutral, objective point of view. But that research should rather be really, really solid. The topic is still dominated today by the publications of well-meaning amateur scholars whose analysis is often driven by wishful thinking. The result is a lot of pseudo-historical narratives that are hard to take seriously by specialists who actually know the relevant languages, in this case, Greek, Coptic, Latin, and who have the technical skills to study manuscripts and early printed sources, which is a very difficult, complicated business, much more complicated than you might think. But the problem is that people are really trained into this kind of research seldom know much about alterations of consciousness. So there is a gap between two groups of scholars. So if the history of entheogenics in Western culture is still not taken seriously enough, as it is, it's far too easy to just put the blame on those narrow-minded academics, which is often done. Actually, if you want to win the battle for academic recognition of these factors in history, then you'd better make sure that your historical and your textual research is really of top-notch quality. And this requires interdisciplinary research between people who know about altered states and about psychedelics, and people who really have the expertise to read these manuscripts, to know the languages, and to be aware of all the difficult technical issues in evaluating such materials. That is my lecture. I hope I've done it exactly in 15 minutes. I haven't kept track, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Wouter, for your fascinating examples. I already see a question about it. We'll get back to that after the second lecture, which will be by Jos ten Berge. Jos is an art historian, assistant professor at VU University in Amsterdam. He wrote his PhD on drugs in art, and where Wouter discussed the influence of psychedelics on our religious history. Jos has his own views on the use of psychedelics and other drugs leading to artistic creativity and masterworks. Jos, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefan. I will share my screen with you. This is visible, I suppose. Very good. Indeed, it has been some time now that I received my PhD on a dissertation entitled Drugs in Art. It was never translated, it was way too fat, but perhaps it will nevertheless allow me to say a few words about these ever intriguing questions, whether drugs can stimulate creativity or even provide artistic inspiration. I will not bother you with art historical hair splittings, but try to touch on a few matters of methodology that may be relevant to various other disciplines too. First, however, two disclaimers to avoid confusion, because first I will not be talking about drug experiences providing inspiration in the sense of providing inspiration afterwards. As far as I can see, artists may draw inspiration from any experience whatsoever. And in this sense, a drug experience is completely equivalent to traveling to a strange country or falling in love or having a car accident or whatever. Indeed, this was also already argued by Masters and Houston in their psychedelic art book. And indeed, if you check the pictures inside this book, it is mostly these post festum pictures, you may say. When asking about drugs in art, people generally mean while intoxicated, while tripping, or whatever you may call it. And that's what I want to talk about. But then my second disclaimer is that I exclude the drugs that assist artists because they keep him awake, like coffee, or because they are good painkillers, killing a chronic pain, etc. Now, this being said, let's take a look at a few historical experiments involving psychedelics and artists. This is a quite exceptional series of portraits that you may have seen before. It was made by one Laszlo Mátéfi, a medical doctor as well as an artist, before, during, and after an LSD trip, Basel, 1951. They are not self-portraits, I must say. They are portraits of the leader of the experiment, whom you see top left. Now, the argument offered by the artist himself is that this series, by its changes, shows that LSD provokes a euphoric kind of schizophrenia, and more implicitly also that it is no good to art. You can see how he has trouble positioning the various parts of the face. He doesn't know anymore where the limbs of the glasses have to go. He zooms in too much so that the head doesn't fit the paper anymore, and his hand moves more and more violently and erratically, failing to convince, to provide a convincing likeness as was his assignment. The interesting thing is that at peak intensity, Mattevi was so irritated about this assignment to make a naturalistic portrait that he threw away his charcoal and his paper. He demanded a large-sized carton and color crayons and then went loose, producing this very dynamic image, which you may see for the first time in your life in color here, and also proportionate to the drawings. And if you look carefully, you can still see something of a profile of the face there. In a second experiment with mescaline, something comparable happened. Now Mattevi concluded from the shriveling and encapsulating forms that mescaline causes a catatonic kind of schizophrenia. And here too, at peak intensity, he produced a much larger and more colorful image. Now the problem is this. The interpretation we are being asked to swallow here is based on the assumption that the two before pictures are to be seen as normal, as a kind of a default. They are the stand-ins for normality that direct us to take all later deviations as signaling distortion or abnormality. But then again, of course, what is normal? Please take a look at the art that this artist Mattevi made, usually his normal work. It looks like this. And there you see a self-portrait on the right, without drugs. And you notice that it has quite a few characteristics in common with his peak intensity images, showing figurative scenes as seen through a cubist prismatic lens, you might say, in very dynamic and colorful compositions. Now, knowing this, it becomes quite hard to insist that the before images should be the normal images. You could just as well argue the exact opposite. Yet before the experiment, Mattevi forced himself to work in a style that society at large indeed may consider normal, but that was not really his. But when peaking, he became incapable as well as unwilling to keep up the pretense and created something that is in fact much closer to his normal style than the before images. And if this is true, then an adjective like mind-revealing would indeed be much more fitting than the other adjectives like abnormal, distorted, psychotic, what have you. The problem here was mostly also that the experiment was made in an exclusively psychiatric setting. And I very much suspect Mattevi of making his interpretations conform to the desires of the initiators and the publishers. Now, next, I'd like to compare two later projects. Involved dozens of artists, but still followed the classic before and after model. The point is that these two research projects reached completely opposite conclusions, and the question, of course, is why? There was a German project conducted by Richard Hartmann in the late 60s, yielding mostly negative results. Almost all of the 50 participating artists decided that LSD affected their work negatively, disturbing motivation and technical control. And a somewhat earlier French project, on the other hand, conducted by neuropsychiatrist Robert Volmat around 1960 with some 30 subjects, yielded mostly positive results. In the eyes of both the researchers and the artists, the artworks demonstrated not a deterioration of technique, but a liberation of latent tendencies, especially in the direction of expressionism and abstraction. Now, how to explain these contradictory results? Well, for one, the Germans took rather high dosages of LSD, while the French took psilocybin, which is reputed to be much more manageable than LSD. Now, I do not want to ignore matters of pharmacology, but there is certainly a lot more to this story. For one thing, Hartmann was an important gallery owner and art dealer who represented most of the artists participating, which means he was very much involved. The German artists were also generally older and quite established, if not famous really, often working in a labor-intensive style of fantastic realism, and they never had taken any drugs before in their lives. They were told that they would be given a drug that would cause a psychosis-like experience, and that they would have to work while this happens, but you do not need to worry, because the goal is not to create great art. Anyway, we will only want to observe the breakdown of your technical capabilities. Well, you can imagine that this resulted in a very defensive set among the artists, most of whom decided to resist the drug effects at all costs. They wanted to show that they could work as they always worked and that this drug would not affect them. This then, of course, didn't work out because it did affect them, leading to much distress and much frustration and causing the generally negative results. While the French, on the other hand, were generally young people, bohemians, or just leaving the art academy, full of ambition, nothing to lose, everything to gain. They were told to expect some disturbances to their usual techniques of working, but this may open up new possibilities for creative expression, perhaps even a breakthrough, if at least they were willing to let go, to accommodate, to improvise, which in some provided a very positive set and setting and also yielded much positive results afterwards. I might add that there is another experiment with many artists by Oscar Janiger in the late 50s that also more or less comparable to the French results. And perhaps I should also add that I'm not judging objectively the artistic qualities of these works, but only report on the feelings of the artists themselves. Now, all of this, I think, confirms that set and setting are crucial. And also that drug experiences apparently can be more or less managed in the direction of, I suppose, any desired effect, including creativity, which answers the second of my major questions. Whether it is art or ends up in our survey books is a completely different matter. That's up to society and to history. And rather than going into this tricky area, I'd like to add a few other observations. Because first, I think the history of art, or any art really, can confirm the importance of set and setting. One intriguing case is presented by the mid-19th century French taste for hashish, which produced reports full of Orientalist references, as might be expected. It also produced reports with various spiritualist interpretations by those with spiritual inclinations, as my esteemed colleague Wouter Hanegraaff surely can confirm. And thirdly, it also produced reports of experiences that were curiously alike those described in Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, especially the references to Piranesi's underground prison drawings. But how is this to be explained? I doubt whether hashish and opium trigger similar visionary experiences. Perhaps the French wanted to capitalize on de Quincey's fame and more or less plagiarized him, or else reading de Quincey had primed their expectations to such an extent that they really had de Quincey-like experiences. After all, as de Quincey put it himself, if a man whose talk is of oxen should become an opium eater, the probability is that he will dream about oxen. I think many historical case studies can confirm that drugs indeed give people what they expect, what they hope for, what they long for, what they want to see, or dread for that matter. And from my own studies, I conclude that drugs often confirm people in prior beliefs. Now, none of this may be true and may be new to you, but I feel it is of some importance in the context of an explicitly interdisciplinary Congress. When I studied more recent experimental research into the matter of mostly alcohol and creativity, researchers had clung to this rather deterministic before and after model, assuming always a post hoc ergo propter hoc attitude that often resulted in variations of the Jekyll and Hyde format. Despite many voices declaring the importance of personality, of interests, of fears and expectations, say from De Quincey in 1821 to Leary in the early 60s, still it was only after or about 1980 that the balanced placebo design was generally adopted. A great step forwards, I'd say, as now it became possible to distinguish between the effects of pharmacology and the effects of expectancies, between nature and nurture, if you like. And so it also was evident that nurture constitutes probably half or even more of the story. Unfortunately, I was unable to offer an I told you so, or I could have told you so, as my own researchers dates only from the 1990s, and I didn't even know what it was, a balanced placebo design then. Nevertheless, there were also other fields that could have told us so, like these anthropologists about alcohol in 1969, telling us that truly significant advances in our understanding of why people do what they do when they are drunk will come only from a more fully informed grasp of society's different understandings of the nature of drunkenness, and not from brain physiology. So indeed, I would like to argue that maybe the point is not to find the pure effects of a drug without the disturbing noise of expectancies of culture, but rather to find out the effects of culture on drug experience apart from, let's say, the distracting noises of chemistry. And if you would be willing to accept this, then I'd like to add that our dealings with SET should not remain limited to someone's particular expectations in a particular situation, but should be expanded with or even embedded in the belief systems of this person's whole culture or subculture. Indeed, it is, I think, important to realize that the whole idea that creativity may profit from drug use is far from universal, but it's a product of romanticism in Western Europe. And all researchers investigating the relationship between drugs and creativity rarely refer to this, but I do hope that they realize themselves that they are involved in an utterly romantic or post-romantic discourse. Their subjects, by the way, also participate in this. So taking expectations into account is one thing, and a good thing, it taught us a lot, but it's still not enough. To really understand what is going on, we need to fly even higher to identify, trace, and explain those expectations, which inevitably brings us to the realms of cultural history. And this, of course, also includes researchers, and it may also preclude the possibility of generalizing our findings. My guess, however, is that ultimately all expectations of drug-induced creativity can be traced back to the 1800s. Now, this is a tough assignment indeed. It means that for many researchers, they would have to enter a completely different field, play a whole new ball game into cultural history. But then again, of course, that is exactly what was meant by interdisciplinary. And so I thank you for listening to somebody maybe as exotic as an art historian. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jos. Our time is almost up, unfortunately. We have 1 minute left or so. There are a number of questions in the chat, especially to Wouter. maybe he will have a look at it. We will also have a separate channel. The link is in the chat where Jos, Wouter and myself will be available for the next 15 minutes for people who want to ask a little more about the subjects and discuss things more. I only have one small question which I would like both to answer, both Wouter and Jos, which I think is a very essential crux, especially in the problem that Wouter signaled about the respectability of this kind of serious scientific research for people, their careers. So in medicine and biomedical sciences, there is a lot of discussion whether people experimenting and using these drugs should have their own experiences with their effects. And I would like a very short answer, although I realize, of course, that it would be more complex, but I would like a very short answer of both Wouter and Jos, whether they feel that historians that study this subject would also have their own experiences of what these drugs do.
Okay.
Wouter?
Okay. Well, I think it's not a necessary thing, but I think it's helpful, and I think it is possible to study these things historically, you know, without having your own experiences with psychedelics. But if you do, then it does certainly make it easier to recognize patterns and influences and all these kind of things. And so, yeah, so I think it's not a necessary, but not a necessary requirement. But I think it is probably easier for somebody who has experiences with psychedelics to really recognize what he or she is studying than if you don't have any experiences with them. At the same time, I also have to say that it depends very much. To relativize that, I would say that I'm very impressed by the differences between different psychedelic substances. So even if you have experience with one particular substance, that it doesn't mean that you necessarily know that much or can recognize it that much about the effects of another one that you will come across in historical sources. So,
yeah, thank you. Jos?
I would agree with that completely. Not necessary, but helpful. I would especially warn not to overestimate its value. Considering the importance of set and setting, if I just may give an example involving myself, if I use marijuana in 2020 here in the Netherlands, I think there is very little to compare with what Charles Baudelaire felt in Paris in the mid-19th century, because I would not like to compare my brain and my intelligence and my sensitivity with that of Baudelaire. And the situation here in the Netherlands in the 21st century is completely different. So how comparable will our experiences be? I doubt it a lot.
Okay, thank you. I now get word that we really have to stop now. I want to invite everybody who wants to talk more about it to go to the chat after talk historical context. The link is in the chat, one of the first messages. And Jos and Wouter and I will be there. And also we'll ask Jos and Wouter to take a look at the Q&A. Or maybe these people who post questions in the Q&A will post them again in the after talk. Thank you very much.
okay.
So just before we close this stream, I want to add that we have a few minutes break, around 7 minutes now. And after the break, we have 3 new tracks starting. And the first one is about psychedelic and psycholytic therapy. And the other one is psilocybin neuroscience. And the other one is microdosing. So for the ones that are interested, please look it up in the agenda, and see you all soon. And don't forget to look at the posters as well and vote for your favorite poster in the Whova app. So see you all soon. Thank you.